And I felt it in Lima. Whenever there were difficulties in the negotiations, there was a wind pushing at the delegates' back that kept them moving forward. And that wind at their back was the positive inertia that was provided by China and the United States when they made a joint announcement November 12th of 2014 of their own targets, which are essentially, in the case of the US INDC, and will probably be the Chinese INDC by September. So I want to comment, because I think it's so important, on the origins of this joint announcement, because I see the origins of it as a convergence of perspectives of these two very important countries. And in terms of climate change, the two most important countries. China's the largest emitter, the US is second. The US is the largest cumulative emitter, but China will overtake the US, even in cumulative emissions, within a decade or two. So why is there this convergence of perspectives? First of all, annual CO2 emissions, as I just said, have converged, so they are the two world's largest emitters. Cumulative emissions are very important. Historic responsibility is taken very seriously by the poorer countries of the world, taken very seriously by the Indian delegation in particular. And these are also converging, and China is going to surpass the US at some point in the next probably 20 years, maybe sooner, depending upon relative rates of economic growth as well as carbon policies. Third, both countries have huge coal reserves as well as natural gas. And both countries, interestingly, are taking action with regards to coal-generated electricity, not necessarily because of climate change, but because of localized air pollution concerns. Everyone knows that's true of China. If you look at the current legislation in the US, you'll see the same thing there. Fourth, both countries have featured the use of cap-and-trade policies at the subnational level. So we've got 7 cities and provinces in China, and then in the US we have Canada and the Northeast states, and others are going to be joining very soon. Fifth and finally, I think, is a convergence of geopolitics. Everyone's fond of saying that the 20th century was the American century, in which the US, obviously, after the wars, the economy blossomed relative to other parts of the world, and it took on a leadership role. People in China, Chinese leaders, either think or hope that the 21st century will be the Chinese century, and when it's your century, you take on global leadership, not obstruction. And the position of China has changed tremendously from what it was 10 years ago in the negotiations. Now, let me say something about why this announcement was significant quantitatively. First of all, the pledges themselves are significant. The US pledge, this is now in the INDC, is a 26 to 28% cut below 2005 by 2025. That's not ambitious relative to the EU, but it doubles the pace of cuts under the previous commitments in the US. And the Chinese pledge was to cap, for the first time, a statement they would cap their emissions by 2030 at the latest. It'll probably happen sooner, and to increase non-fossil energy generation, so that's not just renewables as they're usually thought of, to 20%. And all of this, according to the best analysis, requires pretty aggressive action now, so it's not a matter of just putting it off. The action and the policies need to be in place immediately. Second, what's important is that China and the US are cooperating in the context of the Durban platform, because I see this as the foundation for the future, at least until the countries of the world come upon a different foundation. The second commitment period that we're now in of the Kyoto Protocol accounts for 14% of global emissions. The European Union, that's it. And New Zealand is also on board, although not through Kyoto. With China and the US INDCs, the Paris Agreement, just with that, is 40%. With Europe already on board, it's 50%. I think we'll probably be at 75 or 80% of global emissions being covered by the agreement by December of this year. And the pressure is now there for others to therefore join. So what matters most for meaningful long-term emissions reductions, in my view, is an adequate foundation. That means adequate scope of participation, because the old approach under Kyoto was, in my view, a false start. Because again, even if OECD country emissions went to zero, nothing was going to really be accomplished. The Durban platform offered some promise of that, and the China-US announcement together with Europe sort of launches the realization of that promise. And it does it within the context of CBDR, because look at the difference between China saying it's going to peak its emissions by 2030 and the US immediately reducing emissions. That's a statement of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, the key challenge for Paris really is to ask, can an agreement that is, after all, anchored in domestic political realities adequately address emissions with sufficient ambition? If you're asking, if the question is whether or not it's going to happen in this agreement this year, that we're going to have emissions reductions that put us on a path to 2 degrees centigrade, well, the answer is no, of course not. Of course not, any more than when you start driving the car, that it gets to 100 kilometers per hour within the first second. The question is, what's the acceleration over time? And the question here is, are there ways to enable and to facilitate increased ambition over time? And I would argue that the linkage of regional, national, and subnational policies can be a very important part of the answer. And by linkage, I mean connections among policy systems that allow for emission reductions efforts to be redistributed across systems. If you're talking about cap and trade system, it means allowing for trade from one system to the other. But it's not only of cap and trade mechanisms, as you'll see. Now, it's true, however, that cap and trade is emerging as the instrument of choice in many countries, regionally in the EU, nationally and subnationally. So the EU, New Zealand, Northeast US, California, Quebec, Ontario, China, Korea, and several others. However, not all countries are going to use cap and trade mechanisms, nor should they. Countries' policies will be heterogeneous, and therefore, a key question is how to carry out linkage in a heterogeneous world. The global agreement should accommodate this heterogeneity. Heterogeneity both in terms of the locus of regulation. Is it supranational, as in the EU, or is it subnational, as in California, and the policy instruments, because there will be cap and trade systems, there will be carbon tax systems, there will be emission reduction credit systems, and there will be old-style command and control regulations in some countries. Linkage among these heterogeneous policies is possible, and that's one of the research papers from the Harvard project by Gib Metcalf of Tufts and David Weisbach of the University of Chicago, in which they looked at, and I've done work as well in another paper, looking at how these systems can be linked. And depending upon what the two different policies are that you're trying to link together, the linkage varies from trivially easy, like two cap and trade, to pretty easy, like a cap and trade and a carbon tax, to more difficult, like a carbon pricing mechanism and a performance standard, to very difficult or impossible, which would be a carbon pricing mechanism and a technology standard that isn't quantity-based, that is not performance-based. So the benefits of linkage are huge: lower costs, reduction of market power, because of course you expand the scope of the market, reducing price volatility because you've expanded the scope of the market, although also linkage transmits price volatility from one jurisdiction to another. And importantly, it allows for achievement of this very important principle, particularly to developing countries, the common but differentiated responsibilities, without sacrificing cost effectiveness, because this brings about a common carbon price. But it's a common carbon price the way we get common prices in any market. It's not because of someone in one city deciding how all shoes should be priced. It's because of competitive markets, and similar quality shoes get priced the same. Linkage does the same thing in terms of fostering a common carbon price. So what needs to be in the Paris Agreement to facilitate effective linkage? I've written a paper on this, and I'll tell you at the end, if you want to get any of these papers, how to get them, in which we looked at that very question with support from AIDA and a set of member companies, including, I was going to say GDF Suez, but then I'd be out of date. NG, including NG. So we've written on that. My colleagues on this were both economists and legal scholars. What do we come up with very briefly? The first principle, do no harm. If poorly designed, the 2015 agreement could actually inhibit linkage. Some of you were in Kyoto in 1997 will remember the debates that took place about so-called supplementarity requirements. There are a set of countries right now who would like to put those kind of requirements into the Paris Agreement. The requirement would essentially say 100% or all of your INDC has to be achieved within your own borders. Okay? And the countries that want that are essentially Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and El Salvador, and then one or two others are in and out. They're opposed to markets, although, as you've seen, linkage is much broader than simply markets in the usual sense. If that gets in, then linkage will be destroyed, costs will be driven up, and ambition for this agreement and for future rounds, when the ambition will be increased, will be greatly reduced.